This screencast is going to focus on the concept of campaigning and elections. During this screencast, you're going to have an activity to complete. You're going to create a list of vocabulary words by handwriting the highlighted terms that you're going to see on each screen, and you're going to include a short definition for each of the vocabulary terms. Once you're completed with the screencast, then you're going to submit the vocabulary list by hard copy, not to Canvas, but in class to Ms. Drake. So let's get started with talking about the process of campaigning and elections and how to become an elected official. So starting with step 1, we're going to talk about political parties nominating candidates to run for office. And you'll notice that there are 4 highlighted terms on your screen. So on a piece of notebook paper, I'd like for you to write down those 4 terms, and then as we go through to write down very short definitions for each term. I'd prefer that you keep them at about 1 line, no more than 2 lines per definition, because I'm hoping that that way, if it's short, sweet, and to the point, you'd be more likely to remember the definition for the term. So let's start with what's going on this year that's getting the most publicity, and that's going to be the presidential nomination. So how do you become President of the United States? Well, to begin with, the presidential nomination is very special. It starts with what happened this summer with the National Convention for the Republicans and for the Democrats. And the national conventions for political parties are held every 4 years. So this past summer, the Democrats and the Republicans each held their own national convention. And what happens is that in each state, in each of the 50 states, and also some territories, the political parties will send delegates or representatives to where the national conventions will meet. And there they'll have this giant meeting, and there they will actually cast ballots to nominate the president and vice president, and they will actually write their party platform. Now notice that the definition for party platform is not on your screen. That's something that if you don't remember, you might have to pause and go look up because it was actually a prior definition. So that's how a presidential nomination works. It seems very simple, even though it is a little complicated, because different states will actually hold different types of primary elections in order to get candidates elected to office in terms of a primary election for president. All other candidates that are not running for president are typically nominated for office at a meeting called a caucus. And a caucus is, again, just a meeting where you nominate someone for office, and also a political party will help to write their party platform. So just to kind of give you a quick view of what happened in the Democrat National Convention, this screen is just a quick shot of the Democrat National Convention schedule of what happened this past summer in July at the Democrat National Convention, and some of the seminars and speakers that were present at the Democrat National Convention. And you'll see that it kind of ended on Thursday there with the, of course, main speaker with Hillary Clinton accepting the presidential nomination for the Democrats. And so, of course, if we show the Democrats, then we also have to show the Republicans, or the GOP, which they're known as the Grand Old Party also. And really quickly in July, they also held their national convention. And so you'll see that they also had some themes and some guest speakers. And really quickly, just to kind of go through there so that you could see kind of who some of these people are, anywhere from people who are, people who are in the military, people who are in politics, people who are part of Donald Trump's family, a variety of people who are our guest speakers. Really quickly, just scroll down through there. You see a lot of people are listed for the Republican Party. And of course, if you wanted to go through and take a look for that yourself, you could go back through the screencast, or you can kind of take a look for that yourself just by Google searching the Republican National Convention. So again, the presidential nomination is pretty special in terms of looking at how they are nominated, but in general, every other politician is kind of the same in terms of how they're nominated through a caucus, through a primary election, or what they do pretty much is they will file paperwork to run for office. So going on to step 2, you'll notice there are also 4 terms there. Again, try to keep the definition very brief and maybe keep it on 1 to 2 lines. So for step 2, if multiple candidates are nominated for office, or if they register to run for office, then what will happen is they will have to have a primary election held in the months before the general election. Now, the general election is always in November. According to state laws, and if you remember from some of your readings, that states determine elections. That's actually what's called a reserved power to the states. So the federal government does not determine elections. It's state governments that determine elections. So what happens is that if, say, 5 people are running for the Republicans or 8 people are running for the Democrats for a certain office, then you'll have a primary election. Now, if only one person has registered or is running for a particular office, let's say one person who's a Democrat is running for Senate, then you won't have to have a primary election. But the reason that you want to have a primary election, if you have multiple Republicans running for one, say, Senate seat, it's because you want to be able to edge out the best candidate for the Senate seat for the Republicans and also the best for the Democrats, of course, so that you could square those two off in the general election. So what happens is that during a primary election, you can have either an open primary or a closed primary. Now, honestly, most states tend to favor a closed primary, which means that only members of a political party are allowed to vote in the primary election. So, for example, if you're a registered Republican, you can only vote in a Republican primary. So a registered Democrat will not be able to vote in a Republican primary. Now, if you're registered, say, as an independent or some other third party, or even if you're unaffiliated, in North Carolina, you can choose to vote in one of the 2 main political parties' primaries, either Republican or Democrat. You can't do that in all states. Each state has their own rule about that. So in North Carolina, if you decide, for example, if you are unaffiliated, let's say in this past primary where you had a primary election for the presidency, for example, and you could choose from all of those candidates for the Republicans that were running, or just basically the 2 for the Democrats. It was Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, and you were unaffiliated, so you weren't registered for Democrat or Republican, then you could choose one or the other to vote in for that primary election. Okay, so let's take a look at a quick example at what this means, because I know that can be kind of confusing. So let's say, for example, that there are 3 Republicans who want to run for U.S. Senate and 1 Democrat who wants to run for U.S. Senate. Well, which one of those do you think would not need a primary election? Well, it would be right here, Donald Duck. Donald Duck would not need a primary election, so no primary here. You wouldn't need one because there's only one person running for the Democrat U.S. Senate seat. So you know that person stands a pretty good chance of being the Democrat who could win that Senate seat. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Republicans. The Republicans are going to have a primary election. Why? Because if all 3 of those people, Minnie Mouse, Mickey Mouse, and SpongeBob SquarePants, decide to square off against Donald Duck, well, the Republicans, of course, are going to have a really hard time winning that Senate seat. Why? Because there's 3 of them and 1 Democrat. So remember, one of the main goals of a political party is to get their candidate elected to office. So in order to do that, and the United States is a democracy, you've got to have 51% of the vote or greater. Well, having 3 candidates for office is going to split the vote. So instead of having all the Republicans who could, maybe it would be 51%, or maybe it could be, let's say, 60% vote for one Republican candidate. Maybe instead of the 60%, you might have 20% for each of those Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and SpongeBob, and then Donald Duck will, have then 40% of the vote. So that would not be a good setup. So what happens in a democracy to make sure you have 1 candidate for the Republicans and 1 candidate for the Democrats, you have a primary election for the Republicans here. So what's going to happen is that the Republicans are going to hold their primary months before the November general election. Typically, it's going to be maybe, February, March, or even April. and then one of those candidates is going to win the majority vote for Republicans. So if you're a Republican, you could actually vote in that primary election. If you're registered unaffiliated, you could actually vote in the Republican primary in North Carolina. Democrats cannot vote in the Republican primary in North Carolina. So going with our example, if let's say Mickey Mouse wins the Republican primary, and Donald Duck, of course, was the only Democrat to register for the U.S. Senate race, it's possible, there's no primary there, then what's going to happen is that these two candidates, Mickey Mouse as a Republican and Donald Duck as a Democrat, will run against each other for the U.S. Senate office in the general election in November. And one of those two candidates then, if those are the only two candidates, will become the next U.S. Senator in that particular general election in November. Okay, so let's just say for step 3, let's just say there's a big if, because there's a lot of ifs that could happen in an election. Let's say if there's a candidate that doesn't win a majority of the votes in a primary, and what percentage out of 100 is a majority? That's right, should be 51%. Then you have another key term here. It's called a runoff election. Right here, runoff election is going to be held. So that's one of the terms that I'd like for you to add to your vocabulary list. So a runoff election is held between the two candidates with the most votes. So let's take a look at an example here at on your screen. So let's take a look at the Republican candidate, the Democrat candidate, the Libertarian candidate, and the Green Party candidate. So let's just say that here you go, Mickey Mouse wins 42% of the vote, Donald Duck with 38%, Goofy winning 12%, and Daisy Duck wins 8%. So out of those 4 candidates, no one has won a majority, correct? Because no one's won 51% of the vote or greater. So we have to have a runoff election. So which of those 2 candidates would then face off each other in another election called a runoff election after the general election? That's right, it's going to be these 2 candidates are going to face each other in what's called a runoff election again after the general election in November. Now between those 2 candidates, between Mickey Mouse the Republican and Donald Duck the Democrat, then one of those would stand, of course, a pretty good chance of winning 51% of the vote or greater in a Democratic election. Okay, so I think this is a good place for us to break for part 1 of the screencast, because my screencast can only be 15 minutes long at a time, and it's already been almost 12 and a half minutes. So let's take a quick review through all of the terms for part 1. So on your vocabulary list, that's your handwriting, here's a list of all of the terms that we've covered in part 1 of the screencast. And the next section is going to talk about ways to really campaign throughout elections, and that's going to be in part 2 of the Campaigning and Elections screencast.